At the height of the nearly 9-year war in Iraq, there were 170,000 American troops stationed in Iraq. By the end of this month, there will be zero. Not a single member of the United States military will be stationed in Iraq. They are leaving at a breakneck pace of literally hundreds of troops a day. And the few U.S. bases that remain look like this: vacant lots, abandoned vehicles, empty housing containers, more of a ghost town than a battlefield, more of a desert than a bustling military installation, more of an exit than an occupation. The end of this war will be final and complete. But it's not pretty. And perhaps because it lacks the grandeur of V-Day a half century ago, it's easy to overlook the magnitude of this moment. In Washington today, President Obama met with the Iraqi prime minister to commemorate, my word, not theirs, the end of the war.
This is a historic moment. A war is ending. A new day is upon us. And let us never forget those who gave us this chance. The untold number of Iraqis who've given their lives. More than 1 million Americans, military and civilian, who have served in Iraq. Nearly 4,500 fallen Americans who gave their last full measure of devotion. Tens of thousands of wounded warriors, and so many inspiring military families.
As a candidate, Barack Obama's campaign in the 2008 Democratic presidential primary will always be remembered for and defined by his opposition to the war in Iraq. And thanks in part to that anti-Iraq war position, he won the Democratic primary. 4 years later, foreign policy isn't playing a huge role in the Republican presidential primary, even though we've still got another war going on in Afghanistan, a secret drone war in Pakistan, an unacknowledged drone war in Yemen and Africa, and who knows where else. Foreign policy really just hasn't been part of the discussion much. And that is much to Newt Gingrich's chagrin.
I believe that one of the great weaknesses of the campaign up to now, the debates up to now, has been the absence of a serious discussion about the nature of the world market, the nature of those challenges we face, and the nature of America's role in that world.
America's role in the world is very important to Newt Gingrich. So important, in fact, that in just the last week, he's gotten a lot of attention for saying things about foreign policy and diplomacy and how and who should represent America in the world. And these have been defining moments for his campaign. So, for example, Mr. Gingrich inspired a flurry of emails around this office for wanting to appoint as Secretary of State John Bolton, the Bush administration's representative to the United Nations, who was so radical and unpopular, even Republicans in the Senate refused to vote to confirm him.
If he will accept it, I will ask John Bolton to be Secretary of State.
Previously, Mr. Gingrich praised Mr. Bolton, calling him tough-minded, which is a bit like saying that a typhoon is mildly disruptive. And then there was the Republican debate this weekend, in which candidates were asked to name one opponent they've learned something from. And before I play Newt's answer, keep in mind that he names a guy who, as we're ending one war in the Middle East, wants to start another war in Iran.
Rick Santorum's consistency and courage on Iran has been a hallmark of why, if we do survive, it will be in part because of people like Rick who've had the courage to tell the truth about the Iranians for a long time.
Newt admires the consistency and courage of a guy who would be open to waging war with Iran. And that's not Newt's only doomsday vision. Newt has long been obsessed with the science fictionist fear of electromagnetic pulse, which is basically a nuclear weapon detonated in space that would send out tsunami-like wave of electricity, knocking out everything electronic on Earth, which, quote, a number of scientists say they consider those concerns to be far-fetched. But Mr. Gingrich's most campaign-defining moment on foreign policy, national security, or diplomacy may have happened over the weekend. And for that, I'd very much like to talk to a foreign policy expert. Let's bring in Steve Clemons, Washington editor-at-large for The Atlantic. Mr. Clemons, nice to see you.
Great to be with you again.
So, this weekend, Newt defended calling the Palestinians an invented people. And this is after he was slammed by other GOP contenders for saying that during the debate. Now, were you more surprised by the comment, by the doubling down, or by the reaction of the other candidates to this claim?
I was very disappointed by the candidate. First, I was disappointed by his ignorance, particularly after he had talked so passionately and in a heartfelt way about those of Hispanic origin and descent that were living in gray areas in the United States. And, you could somewhat callously say that these two are an invented people. But in the Middle East, the Palestinians are not invented. And I'll use Elliot Abrams, one of George W. Bush's Middle East advisors on the National Security Council, said, essentially paraphrasing, what planet is Newt on? That fundamentally most of the Middle East was carved up and invented by the British after World War II and those, in the deals. And so to some degree, what he said about Palestinians was so uninformed that even the most right-wing Republicans who've been very, very tied into this for a very long time, and you would arguably say are in a zero-sum game pro-Israel, disavowed Newt Gingrich's comments.
Now, look, this was also surprising to me in part because Newt Gingrich often sort of presents himself as Professor Gingrich. And, many peoples are invented. American peoples are invented from all of these different identities from which we come. So what is it? Is there a signal that he is meaning to send to Republican primary voters with that assertion? What is it that he wants them to hear when he calls?
Well, I think we're in an era right now where I think Newt Gingrich in this particular case and other candidates have done the same thing, have been trying to reach out to those who give a lot. And to some degree, the Republican Party is right now in a competitive race with the Democratic Party, trying to act as if it is the party that can deliver most closely on what it sees as Israel's interests. What's very sad about this is that Israel's real interests in the long run are becoming connected with its neighborhood and getting that neighborhood to end to some degree the hostility towards it, and that animating and flaming the fires of antagonism between Arabs and Muslims on one side and Israelis on the other is in many cases a fundraising tactic. And I think it's got to stop. But that's what Newt was trying to do in this case. And I think it shows that in this particular case, he's clearly running for president, but he's not demonstrating his role as a strategist, as somebody sitting behind the desk in the Oval Office, making very complex choices between America's interests abroad and sorting out its allies and how it needs to encourage them to move into a more stable situation.
Well, and so it feels to me like these incendiary comments about the Palestinian people, and then also this sort of, odd doomsday scenarios that Mr. Gingrich often presents, particularly the electromagnetic pulse.
Something out of the Cold War.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Is there some kind of fear-mongering that he is expecting to work strategically going on here?
Well, I've known Newt Gingrich since 1994, not particularly well. He was on the board of the Nixon Center, and part of Newt Gingrich is realist, and part of him is tied up and distracted by exotic ideas. And I think one of them, the notion that you can have an electromagnetic pulse, is actually scientifically correct. We could all go back to vacuum tubes, as we once thought about during the Cold War, to kind of keep ourselves from being vulnerable to that. But it's so beyond the kind of regular experience. It raises fundamental questions, again, about how he would think about war and conflict and setting up systems where the United States can pursue its interests boldly and where its vulnerabilities are. And if we have a kind of, a professor who's distracted by something that's so exotic and so potentially alien to anything that's real, it raises fundamental questions about how good a strategist he'll be, and do you trust this guy to have his finger next to the nuclear football? I think it's raised a lot of doubts about Newt Gingrich.
Yeah, it certainly makes me anxious. Steve Clemons, Washington editor-at-large for The Atlantic and editor-in-chief of Atlantic Live. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Great to be with you.
Thanks.